Coming up in this episode of In Clear Focus.
Ultimately, brands are there to perform two tasks, really. The first is to help sustain demand, and the second is to generate loyalty.
You're listening to In Clear Focus, fresh perspectives on the business of advertising, produced weekly by Big Eye. Hello, I'm your host, Adrian Tennant, VP of Insights at Big Eye, a strategy-led, full-service creative agency growing brands for clients globally. Thank you for joining us. Today's podcast marks the launch of the Big Eye Book Club in partnership with our friends at Kogan Page. To kick things off, it's my pleasure to welcome an expert in delivering brand-led business growth, who is also the co-author of our featured book club selection this month, Myths of Branding. A brand is just a logo, and other popular misconceptions. Simon Bailey has led several well-known global branding consultancies and is now managing partner of the Caffeine Partnership. Simon appears regularly in the media discussing marketing and branding. To discuss brand strategy and the book he co-authored, Simon is joining us today from his home office in London, England. Simon, welcome to In Clear Focus.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
How did your early career lead you to brand strategy?
Yeah, it was a kind of interesting start. I originally trained as a lawyer and graduated law school, but I came out and I sort of had a sense that maybe the law wasn't for me. So I went to London, as you do, to sort of seek your fortune. And actually, I finished up working for the Guardian Media Group. And at that point, the MD of the business was Carolyn McCall. And Carolyn McCall went on to run an airline and now runs the ITV Media broadcast network. But at the time, and this was quite a few years ago, she spent a lot of time talking about how the Guardian newspaper was a brand. And that actually, as a result, as representatives of the newspaper, we should be confident about what the brand stood for and also why it could justify a price premium. And actually, that got me thinking quite a bit about the subject of branding and brands because we were talking about it so much. And that ultimately led me to a position where I saw a job advertised for a very well-known sort of leading brand business. I went to see the CMO at the time of The Guardian and said, if you were going to work with a brand business, who would you work for? And he was kind enough to put the one I was going to potentially try and work for at the top of the list. So I thought that's really interesting. And then I joined that business. And then over 20 years, worked for both Omnicom and WPP and finished up leading businesses for both those organizations.
Now, you've known the co-author of Myths of Branding, Andy Milligan, for 20 years or so. How did you two first meet?
Well, actually, I will say this the once, I'll give them a name check. Andy was working at Interbrand, and I then came to Interbrand and met Andy. And Andy's a couple of years older than me. I won't reveal any more than that. But he, at the time, then was one of the sort of leading lights in their strategy teams and naming teams as well. And got to know him through that. And then we've remained in contact and good friends really ever since. And then, of course, more recently, we joined together in the Caffeine Partnership.
So how do you define a brand?
Well, of course, there is a legal definition, things like the name, the design, the symbol, and many other facets, which technically help to differentiate the goods and services of one undertaking over another. And that's important because, of course, brands are protectable. But actually, it's probably more helpful to think about brands as a mix of functional and emotional attributes that you associate with a particular product or service. If it's more helpful and you want to simplify it further, you could probably talk about the real estate that you've got to occupy in somebody's mind, or potentially even the famous quote by Jeff Bezos when he said that a brand is really the things that people say about you when you're not in the room, which is kind of nice, succinct definition.
Can you tell us a bit about the work the Caffeine Partnership undertakes for clients?
Yeah, sure. So the Caffeine Partnership is focused on helping impatient leaders accelerate growth. And we do that through three distinct areas. So brand, helping people leverage the power of their brands. Customer experience, so helping customers to have a fantastic experience, but more importantly, the owners to focus on what matters most for their customers and making sure that's consistent across the experience. And then finally, what you'd broadly term brand engagement. And that can cover anything from helping to facilitate a board meeting or a strategy away day, all the way through to helping large organizations mobilize workforces, get people behind an idea, or indeed help them understand how they need to take on a brand or deliver a fantastic experience.
So, what prompted you to write a book focusing on misconceptions about branding?
I think the glib answer, and I was talking to Andy about this, is essentially we were actually asked to do it. So that's one thing. But of course, it's also a field littered with misconceptions. Together, we thought actually it would be a great opportunity to bust a few myths and to try and give our own point of view on the subject. And also an opportunity to lay down some of the things that we may have learned or experienced over the years.
So, Simon, let's start with the titular misconception: a brand is just a logo. Where did this idea originate and why is it a myth?
Ultimately, because it's such a persistent myth, I think that's why it became the title for the book. It's the one that we hear most frequently throughout our time in the sector, really. And of course, brands are so much more than just a logo, which is why it can also be maddening and a bit frustrating. But I think the reason for that is that it's the logo that people do identify with. That's the job of the logo, to act as an identifier for goods and services and experience. It's the promise of an experience to some extent. And so I think what happens is those people that are more skeptical about brands or don't like them or just want to be a bit derogatory about them will say, well, brands are just about the logo. And they'll tend to believe that's what it's all about. And of course it isn't. It's much more than that. And it struck us that was the most frequently encountered, most common, almost meta myth that we would try and address head on and have a bit of fun with it and make it the title of the book.
Well, chronologically, the first myth in the book is brands are just a way of charging you more for the same product. But you write that brands are rarely that.
When you buy the brand, you aren't just buying the immediate product or service that's in front of you. You're actually buying all of the marketing investment that's gone into building that brand in the first place. And actually, that really matters because we identify with brands. They are, to some extent, an expression of kind of who we are and the values that we hold. But brands, of course, also act as a kind of guarantor of quality or the promise of a specific type of experience. To give you a practical example, if you were in a fortunate position to be able to afford a Louis Vuitton handbag, yes, of course, you are buying into some of the intrinsics, what you would hope to be good quality, great design. But you are also buying into an experience and a lifestyle. And that's partly what you're paying for, really. And consumers understand that. If you want to invert that idea for a minute, think about it the other way around. When people buy a fake Rolex, and I'm sure that people may have done that in the past, you are really paying less for less. It's great fun, but close scrutiny usually reveals that it's a fake. And even if people don't spot it straight away, then you'll rarely find it keeping good time in a couple of years. Consumers understand the trade-off and they understand that in the end, brands are much more than just the product. They are a whole kind of collection of attributes that they're buying into.
Myth 13 in the book is branding is subjective. It's all fluff and art with no rigor and science. Now, marketing has academic literature, including journals and studies, that underscore its status as an established discipline. Advertising, too, boasts several professional bodies that offer models of advertising effectiveness. But as you point out, the misconception about branding means that it hasn't attained quite the same level of respect. Why do you think that is?
I think it's because ultimately a brand or the brand isn't consistently owned by the same person or group of people across different types of organizations. So, for example, if you think about a large FMCG business, you'll often have people called brand managers. But actually, when you look more closely, those brand managers are really marketeers. They're often responsible for the P&L and for the end-to-end performance of the brand.
So, a quick UK English to US English translation. In the UK, FMCG stands for fast moving consumer goods, which in the US are generally known as CPG or consumer packaged goods. Different terms, but they mean the same.
Thanks, Adrian. In another organization of a different size or orientation, you might find the brand owned by the finance department or the legal department, because for that business, brand has always sat with legal because they're the ones that entertain any issues or infringements. In another business, you might find someone charged with the brand or called a brand manager or brand director, where their job is to make sure that the brand is applied consistently or managed appropriately across channels. You'll have some people focused on trying to make sure that the brand idea is manifest across all those channels. And then you'll have businesses, possibly the more enlightened ones, where the CEO themselves see themselves as the brand manager in a sense. And I think it's to do with the fact that it doesn't belong in a place necessarily, that branding sometimes struggles to achieve the kind of professional parity that you would expect us to believe that it does ultimately deserve. So I think that's probably at heart of some of these issues.
Myth number 6 is brands don't have financial value. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, we would assert that brands most definitely do have a value, and that value can be quantified. And I think it's important, before we just look at some examples, to reflect on why they can. And that's because ultimately brands are there to perform fundamentally 2 tasks, really. The first is to help sustain demand, and the second is to generate loyalty. They are, in a sense, a guarantee of future revenues. As far back as, I think, 1988, and I'll give you a few figures, but treat them as indicative, because whenever you go back and have a look at these things, they change depending on who reported them. But Philip Morris bought Kraft in 1988 for approximately $12.9 billion, which at the time was 4 times the tangible value of the business. Similarly, I think Grand Met, a little bit later, acquired Pillsbury for something like $5.5 billion, which was a 50% premium on book value. And as we come through the decades, in 2011, Kraft bought Cadbury, the chocolate and confectionery manufacturer, and that obviously went on to form Mondelez. And Kraft paid for that approximately $19.6 billion, which at the time was something like 13 times their EBITDA, so their earning before interest, tax, deductions, and so on. And actually, for this asset, I saw a commentator describe that as a very good price. So all of that intangible value is being allocated. And then later on, in 2017, Amazon purchased Whole Foods, and I think nearly 70% of the purchase price was allocated to goodwill. And of course, goodwill and brand value are not quite the same thing, but within that conduit of goodwill will sit a substantial amount of brand value. And I thought it's interesting just to reflect on 2 more things very quickly. I think it's always been part of Warren Buffett's investment strategy, if you go back, to invest in very well-known, very well-established brands, because in a sense, they're less risky. They are there to generate future revenues. There's a higher level of confidence. That's what they'll be able to achieve. And then today, I looked just at one of the valuation league tables, one of the more established ones, and Apple's brand value is, in their view, worth approximately $400 billion. Hopefully some examples to get people thinking. Of course, it's also recognized in various accounting standards as well as a genuine asset.
So, from a practical perspective, Simon, how should organizations arrive at a financial value for their brands?
There are different methods of valuing brands, and I think listeners might begin to glaze over if we get into the intricacies of those. But I think it's probably worth saying that there are purely financial approaches, which if there's any accountants listening to, they'll understand the kind of process and method that you approach to do that. But then there are methods and approaches which seek to delve a bit deeper. And what they do, or certainly the ones that have achieved suitable accreditation, what they try to do is establish the amount of earnings that are attributable to the brand, and they call those brand earnings. And they will then try and combine that with an assessment of how strong they think the brand is or how well managed it is. And that's used then to create a discount curve, which enables them to establish almost like a net present value over a certain time horizon. And that will provide a value for the brand and for the assets. And that brand strength factor then, depending on how you choose to do that, can be done with consumers so that you're getting that fed directly into the process. It's also worth just mentioning this as an adjunct, which is, of course, the role of the brand in generating earnings differs by category. So if you take petrol retailing, brands are valuable, but the role of the brand in petrol or gas retailing is going to be much smaller than it will be in, say, the luxury apparel category. Because when you're looking for a gas station, You may have a preferred brand, but if that's not available, you'll definitely fill up at the one that's closest to you. It's convenient. Whereas in luxury branding, you're really buying that brand, and it's that brand and nothing else that you're seeking. So they'll look to establish, when they're looking at those brand earnings, the amount that's attributable to the brand.
Let's take a short break. We'll be right back after these messages.
I'm Dana Cassell, Big Eye's Senior Strategist. Every week, In Clear Focus addresses topics that impact our work as marketing professionals, often inspired by data points reported in consumer research studies. At Big Eye, we put audiences first. For every engagement, through our own research, we develop a deep understanding of our clients' prospects and customers, analyzing their attitudes, behaviors, and motivations. We distill this data into actionable insights to inspire creative brand building and persuasive activation campaigns with strategic, cost-efficient media placements. If you'd like to know more about how to put Big Eye's audience-focused insights to work for your brand, please contact us. Email info@bigeyeagency.com.
Each month, in partnership with our friends at Kogan Page, the Big Eye Book Club features interviews with authors who are experts in specific areas of marketing. January's featured book is Myths of Branding by Simon Bailey and Andy Milligan. In Clear Focus listeners can save 20% on a print or electronic version of the book with exclusive promo code BIGEYE20. That's BIGEYE20. This code is valid for all products and pre-orders and applies to Kogan Page's free ebook offer. To learn more, visit our website at bigeyeagency.com/insights. Welcome back. I'm talking with Simon Bailey, the co-author of this month's Big Eye Book Club selection, Myths of Branding, A Brand is Just a Logo and Other Popular Misconceptions. Myth number 20 is there's no such thing as brand loyalty. Professor Byron Sharp of the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, who's also the author of How Brands Grow, believes that brand loyalty does not exist and that consumers typically choose from a basket of brands. But you think he's wrong.
Well, actually, it's not so much that he's wrong. I think we're making a slightly different argument in our book. And what we're saying is that actually we agree that in a lot of instances, consumers don't tend to spend enormous amounts of time thinking about brands. You're not lying in your bed very often thinking about, at any great depth, your supermarket brand, for example. Actually, brand owners might have milliseconds to occupy some kind of mental real estate that we talked about. So we don't really take issue with that we're, perceive ourselves certainly to be time poor and lots of things competing for our attention. Our point really is that differentiation and being distinctive are really the same thing. And to back that up, if you look at the dictionary definitions, you'll find that each one refers to the other in an attempt to define what it does. So we think it's a slightly semantic distinction, really, which is that in the end, what brands have to be is memorable. And if they achieve a memorable status in your mind and they're there and you're thinking about them when you're making a relevant purchase, then that's achieved its job. So we think that's a bit semantic. Brands have to be memorable. They have to stand out. And to some extent, it was ever thus. What I would say, though, is that he does make really interesting and well-evidenced observations about how brands are built, or if you want to get technical, how to drive penetration. But I think even those instructions or suggestions are sometimes misinterpreted, either because people, don't take the time to read it or haven't always fully understood exactly what he means.
Yum Brands Chief Marketing Officer Ken Munch oversees global marketing for KFC, Pizza Hut, and Taco Bell. He recently told Marketing Week, and I quote, "Brand purpose truly is a bunch of," and I won't say what he said, but it's an expletive, "because it's disingenuous. You're saying, my purpose is to make the world a better place. No, your purpose is to make money," end quote. Simon, your thoughts on Ken's comments, please.
Yeah, you might have to stop me on this one, Adrian. This is a bit of a caffeine specialist subject. We write a lot about purpose, and Andy has written actually a couple of books on purpose. And as you know, there's a chapter on that in the book. So I think the first thing is we'd say, actually, no. And we challenge what he said. We'd say that the purpose of a business fundamentally is to deliver value to the customer. And by doing that, you deliver value to shareholders and beyond. And that's quite an important point. And to be fair to him, I think he does go on in his interview to make the point that he thinks that brands and businesses should improve. He's just taking issue with a thing that we think people often do, which is conflate or confuse purpose with CSR responsibilities or the ESG agenda. Because actually for us, purpose is really seeking to answer the why. So in other words, why you are in business, or if you like, why you do what you do.
Just to explain a couple of acronyms, CSR is Corporate Social Responsibility, and ESG is short for Environmental, Social and Corporate Governance.
Yeah, and actually we'd argue that there's plenty of evidence to suggest that consumers care not just about what you do or what you offer, but increasingly why you do it. So I would point listeners in the direction of the Havas Meaningful Brand Survey, and they make some fascinating points about how consumers engage with brands that they fundamentally perceive as more meaningful, and they generate 9 times the share of wallet. And they are the brands which, if not available, a consumer would wait for. Whereas in most instances, consumers will often buy the brands that come to them. Purpose for us needs to be customer-led. That's a really important distinction. They need to be really focused, first of all, on how they deliver value for customers, but then they need to also take account of, obviously, the financial and societal impact of what they do. A good business should be always looking to mitigate its impact and to make a positive contribution to a business. That's just the rules of the game for being in business and to be a successful brand. But for us, a purpose is seeking to deliver value for customers and to answer that question, which is why. And that why matters because we're living in many economies in a place where there are lots and lots of choice. And consumers are increasingly asking, okay, not just what's this, but why do you do what you do? What's behind what you do? I can give you a very good example. It is a UK one. We did some work for Premier Inn, which is a kind of budget hotel group. And we worked with them to establish a purpose. And after lots of work, we alighted on a purpose really about giving customers a brilliant night's sleep. And the reason that purpose was so motivating is it sits at the kind of intersection of what we believed mattered most to both the customers that went there and the employees that were there to deliver the experience. Because if you're staying in one of these kind of budget to mid-priced hotels, what you're looking for is a great night's sleep because you're getting up for a sales conference or a meeting, or if it's at the weekend, it's a wedding or a christening or those types of activities. You want to feel great and you want to feel motivated. But the really important point, and I think this serves to illustrate the power of purpose, is that the group then, it's quite a large group, decided that they were going to focus their experience around that idea too. And so they invested in a Hypnos bed solution, which is a high-end bed that you would normally find in a 5-star hotel, put those in all their hotel rooms. They fixed all the air conditioning, made sure that everything was working on a soundproofing level, and then taught and trained their staff to help deliver to customers a brilliant night's sleep, including some little behavioural nudges and signs asking people to be quiet at night. And it's been fantastically successful as a brand because it's very clear and very purposeful about what it's doing. So for us, that's an example of delivering value to customers, which delivers value to shareholders through a customer-led purpose.
Between the original publication of Myths of Branding in 2019 and our conversation today, the world's population has been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Based on the changes you've observed in consumer behaviours, what lessons can we apply to brand strategy moving forward?
We've got a new edition of Myths of Brands coming out next year, and that's currently being written. And we will try and update the book and hopefully capture some of these key changes, because of course a lot's happened in a relatively short period. But in a sense, and aside from the loss of life and the negative consequences it's had for many people and many families, and the next point is not to diminish that. That needs to be acknowledged. But it's really just to say that in another sense, COVID, whether we like it or not, has finished up being a huge social experiment. Because actually nobody really knows exactly what is going to happen. They don't. And the reason for that is that we know that some behaviour, although not all, some behaviours will probably have been changed forever as a result of the pandemic, and that the pendulum will swing to a new direction to form a habit. Well, we've had, depending on your jurisdiction, probably over 2 years of people behaving differently, and it's likely that some of those behaviours will stick. I think where you can begin to be more confident, and I can assure you that brand owners across the world of every shape and size are busy scratching their heads and employing people to kind of help them navigate some of these things. But I think you could probably take a view that things like safety and security and health and wellness, including mental health, these are all factors which I don't think are going to go away anytime soon. I think that for certain parts of the population in certain countries all over the world, those things are going to remain big issues. But we will undoubtedly also see people wanting to spend and go out and enjoy themselves where they can. And I think, again, in certain economies, you can see that happening. And you can see that happening in the big numbers, things like inflation and the shortage and availability of products, as well as, stuff that you might be able to point to more anecdotally. But I think it's fair to say that those changes are underway. And there'll be lots of other things as well. I mean, that's probably the tip of the iceberg of some of the changes. But I think what we have definitely seen also is how adaptable technology has become. And so I'm amazed that even bars and restaurants in my local community did an amazing job of, when they were able to, turning their premises into tech-enabled, COVID-compliant retail outlets. It was absolutely amazing. In fact, some of their apps are better than some I've seen, in organizations many times bigger. And secondly, the flexibility that it will afford for new ways of living and working. And I think that flexibility has definitely worked for certain groups of people. And I think that there will be a clamour and a petitioning for people to be able to work more flexibly in the future. I don't think that's going to go away. And I also have a sense of that because when I speak to friends and contacts, for example, in the real estate business, this is an immediate live issue, whether it's, retailing on the high street, office accommodation, thinking about new buildings and how things are changing. The demand at the moment for logistics space and the ability to meet online demand is all happening in real time right now.
Simon, if In Clear Focus listeners would like to learn more about you, your work at the Caffeine Partnership or Myths of Branding, where can they find you?
Hopefully we've got a memorable name. So you should be able to find the Caffeine Partnership. You'll find us online. We've obviously got a website. This is caffeine.com, where you'll find further information about us, including details of the people in the business, myself and Andy and my colleagues. But you can, of course, also buy the book. And of course, we're on all the key social channels.
And In Clear Focus listeners can, of course, take advantage of a special promo code that takes 20% off Myths of Branding or any other Kogan Page title. Go to koganpage.com, that's Kogan with a K, and enter the code BIGEYE20, that's BIGEYE20 at checkout. This also applies to Kogan Page's free ebook offer. You're the first author we've interviewed for the Big Eye Book Club. So Simon, thank you very much indeed for being our guest this week.
Brilliant. Thanks for having me, Adrian. I appreciate it.
Thanks to my guest this week, Simon Bailey of the Caffeine Partnership and the co-author of Myths of Branding. You'll find a transcript with links to the resources we discussed today on the In Clear Focus page at bigeyeagency.com under Insights. Just select Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider following us wherever you listen to podcasts and contributing a rating or a review. Thank you for listening to In Clear Focus, produced by Big Eye. I've been your host, Adrian Tennant. Until next week, goodbye.